China's military is growing. Can the U.S. handle it? Find out how the U.S. military is gearing up to deter the Chinese Communist Party. Welcome back to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. Is the Pentagon equipped to fight China? According to U.S. Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, China is the #1 focus of the Pentagon.
We are now in an era of great power competition, and that China, then Russia, constitute our top strategic competitors.
Poor Russia. Taking a backseat to China? The Soviets always made better villains in the movies and video games. Probably they made better villains because the Soviets didn't own shares in U.S. companies. With China, that can lead to awkward things like a U.S. company censoring their video game trailer because they showed Tiananmen Square protest footage. But enough about the old Cold War. Now everyone is talking about the new Cold War between the U.S. and China. Nobody wants it to turn into a boots-on-the-ground conflict, but it could happen. The Chinese Communist Party has been rapidly modernizing its military. In a 2017 speech to China's National People's Congress, Chinese leader Xi Jinping said, "We will make it our mission to see that by 2035, the modernization of our national defense and our forces is basically completed, and that by the mid-21st century, our people's armed forces have been fully transformed into world-class forces." Side note, Xi Jinping does plan to still be in charge by mid-century. He'll be a spry 97 years old. So in the 3 years since that speech, the Chinese Communist Party has been busy. For instance, the nuclear triad. That's the ability to launch a nuclear weapon from land, sea, or air. And it looks like China has completed it. But nukes are just a small part of modern warfare. 21st century warfare involves land, air, sea, cyberspace, and regular space. China's People's Liberation Army has made strides in all of them. That's why some analysts are saying the U.S. could lose a war with China, especially the coming space war. According to some war game simulations, the U.S. has already lost its dominance. For the next clip, keep in mind that the U.S. is Team Blue.
In our games, when we fight China or Russia, blue gets its ass handed to it. Not to put too fine a point on it. We lose a lot of people, we lose a lot of equipment, we usually fail to achieve our objective of preventing aggression by the adversary.
Now you might think, so what? Why should the U.S. be the only country that has a strong military? What's wrong with China wanting one as well? Well, remember, China is ruled by a brutal authoritarian regime. It doesn't have freedom of speech or freedom of the press. So no one inside China can criticize how the government uses the military. Sorry, did I say how the government uses the military? I misspoke. You see, the Chinese government doesn't actually have a national military. China's People's Liberation Army, the PLA, is the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party itself. Its primary purpose is to keep the Communist Party in power. Here's what Xi Jinping said about the PLA in that speech I mentioned earlier. The party's goal of building a strong military in the new era is to build the people's forces into world-class forces that obey the party's command. And the Communist Party considers itself at war with the United States. They've said so for decades. It's in their publicly available speeches and strategic documents. So what do you think the Chinese Communist Party would do with a world-class military, one that could rival the United States? Well, according to the Council on Foreign Relations, the People's Liberation Army is aiming to become the dominant force in the Asia-Pacific, strengthening China's hand toward Taiwan and international disputes in the South China Sea. And that wouldn't be bad for just those countries. $5 trillion of international shipping goes through the South China Sea. If the Chinese Communist Party controlled that, then all the ships that travel through the South China Sea would have to submit to the Communist Party's terms. But according to Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, the Pentagon is prepared for China. I wonder if he knows about those war games where China kicks America's butt. To counter China, the Pentagon is investing in both advanced conventional capabilities and game-changing technologies such as hypersonic weapons, 5G communications, integrated air and missile defense, and artificial intelligence. In 2018, the Department of Defense laid out a new national defense strategy for the first time in a decade. And it's pretty focused on China and Russia, but mostly China.
The priority that drives and underlies many of our efforts today is to focus the department on China. To do this, we established a China Strategy Management Group to push that agenda forward. I also directed the National Defense University to refocus its curriculum by dedicating 50% of the coursework to the PRC. And I tasked the military departments and services to make China the pacing threat in all of our schools, programs, and training.
That's a really huge change. Since the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. military has been focused on fighting in the Middle East. Pivoting to counter the Chinese Communist Party is a big undertaking, and it shows the shift in U.S. policy toward China over the past few years. Here's how the 2008 National Defense Strategy talked about China and Russia. Both China and Russia are important partners for the future, and we seek to build collaborative and cooperative relationships with them. We will develop strategies to provide incentives for constructive behavior, while also dissuading them from destabilizing actions. And here's the 2018 National Defense Strategy. It is increasingly clear that China and Russia want to shape a world consistent with their authoritarian model. China and Russia are now undermining the international order from within the system by exploiting its benefits while simultaneously undercutting its principles. Sounds like those incentives for constructive behavior from 2008 really worked. In 2008, the Obama administration still viewed China as a strategic partner. But in 2017, the Trump administration started calling China a strategic competitor. Sorry, partner. Now, Trump didn't come up with the strategic competitor label. That was actually George W. Bush during his first run for president. He said China should be viewed as a strategic competitor, not a strategic partner. That was after President Clinton met with then Chinese leader Jiang Zemin and agreed to work toward a constructive strategic partnership between the two nations. But the Bush administration dropped the strategic competitor angle after they wanted China's support for the war on terror. So in the last 25 years, the US government has spent far more time trying to work with the Chinese regime than calling it out. Now, to be fair, it wasn't always clear how dangerous the Chinese Communist Party was to the US. But on the other hand, they have been persecuting their own people for a long time. During the first Bush administration, during the Clinton administration, during the next Bush administration, and during the Obama administration. Now, the US government didn't like that, but they were willing to look the other way, because they wanted the Chinese Communist Party to work with them to fight terrorism, be a responsible global stakeholder, make US companies rich, etc. But it's become more and more clear over the years that a brutal authoritarian regime that terrorizes its own people also poses a security threat to the US. Like how they've been robbing US companies blind. Or that time they covered up the deadly coronavirus for 6 weeks. And as a result, we're all in permanent lockdown. But perhaps most telling is what the Chinese Communist Party has been doing in the South China Sea, as I mentioned earlier. For nearly a decade, they've been building artificial islands and putting military installations on them. And although the US complained at the time, the US didn't actually stand up to China. In Beijing, some talk of a Scarborough model, a template for China gradually to exert control over the Western Pacific by snapping up one land feature at a time, a sort of incremental revisionism that slowly squeezes out the US without ever providing a reason for a confrontation. It's named after the Scarborough Shoal, which is claimed by both China and the Philippines. Back in 2012, it looked like Filipino and Chinese forces were actually going to go to blows over it. The Chinese Coast Guard had occupied the Scarborough Shoal, but the Obama administration stepped in and negotiated a deal where both sides would leave. The following week, the Philippines ships left the Scarborough Shoal and returned home. The Chinese, however, stayed in the area. And there were no consequences from the U.S. In fact, China still occupies the Scarborough Shoal. That was definitely the case when I went out there in 2016. To many U.S. allies in the region, this was a sign that the U.S. would not back them if there was a confrontation with China. So the Trump administration has been trying to rebuild U.S. alliances in the region and around the world, and let them know that the U.S. has their backs.
I have also personally conducted over 200 meetings with foreign partners from over 60 countries and engaged world leaders during more than a dozen conferences to reaffirm the United States' role as the global security partner of choice.
I know that might sound surprising since you've probably heard all about how Trump has left the U.S. alone and humiliated, not to mention isolated, but that's not the whole story. Working with allies is a key part of the new national defense strategy. For example, the U.S. and Australia just expanded their military cooperation. Both countries have also been working with India and Japan to advance a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. For more on that, see my episodes on whether the U.S. could form an Asian NATO and on how Trump wants India to counter China. And since 2016, the U.S. has also been working with Southeast Asian countries plus Taiwan through the Maritime Security Initiative. The initiative aims to improve the ability of these countries to address a range of maritime challenges, including China's growing assertiveness in the South China Sea. So the good news is that even if some world leaders are annoyed at Trump's America First policy, most of them are even more wary of Xi Jinping's China First policy, and so they're leaning towards America. Once again, the Chinese Communist Party is bringing the rest of us together. So what do you think about the national defense strategy's focus on China? Is the U.S. ready for a war with China? Write to me in the comments below. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching America Uncovered.